Hello and welcome to another Denis Wick Products interview. My name is Brett Baker and it gives me great pleasure today to talk to Jamie Hood, somebody I've known for many, many years. So welcome to this interview, Jamie.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
No problem at all. It's a pleasure to be able to catch up and have a bit of a chat to you. So yours is a complicated story, I think it's fair to say, in terms of where you live. But just for reference, we should explain that you live in Switzerland, I think just on the border, but you're actually originally from Scotland and you had a bit of a detour in between.
Yes, I did. I was born in Scotland, and at the age of 14, I was born in Ayrshire. And at the age of 14, I moved to the Alsace region of France with my family. My father took up employment in that area. It was just on the French-Swiss border with Basel, and stayed there for a long number of years until I then went back, in fact, to Glasgow to study at the time it was called the what was it called? The Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama. It's since changed its name. And then after a while there, then I came back, and then in 2006, I emigrated after having met my wife, Wendy. I immigrated to the US and spent some time in Houston and also in Charlotte, North Carolina, Portland, Oregon, and then 4 years ago returned to the same area. So I actually live in France. I live in Alsace, but I work every day in Switzerland, either teaching or conducting or playing. So that's a brief overview as to why I'm here.
Yeah, and I guess it's fair to say that you were moving around the United States because you were working for the Salvation Army at the time, involved in projects for them. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct. When I went to Houston, then I was a performing arts director for the city of Houston, and I was responsible for implementing 6 or 7 performing arts centers around the city of Houston. And then when we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, I was a divisional music director, responsible for the Salvation Army's Music and Arts Ministry throughout North and South Carolina. And in 2014, we left the Carolinas and we went to the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, where it rains just as much as it does in Scotland, which is why it's always green. Beautiful part of the country, and we were there. I was also responsible for the Army's work in music ministry in Oregon and southern Idaho. So in actual fact, quite a large area. But I loved it, and 4 years ago, we then decided that we would like to come back, or that I would come back, and that obviously Wendy and the twins came with us. So we've now been here. We're going on our fifth year. So yeah.
Great. So what inspired you to take up the cornet and then trumpet later on, as opposed to any other instrument? I mean, you could have played the flute, you could play the violin, the piano, but what was it about cornet that attracted you?
Well, I tried the piano at one point, and that didn't go very well. But why the cornet? My father also played in the Salvation Army band in Kilburn, and there were always instruments lying around. My father was he was a versatile player, but not in the sense where he couldn't play anything, so he just get handed different things. He was actually a good player, and he played tenor horn and cornet, and then latterly he also played euphonium and E-flat bass. But when I was growing up, he was playing a tenor horn and a cornet, and I used to go and, you always want to do what your dad does. Well, maybe not always, but I certainly did. And so seeing him play and seeing him practice at home, then I used to go and open the cases and just kind of playing whatever was there. And one occasion he had just been given a brand new cornet, and I took it out the case to play, and either my hands were too small, but the thing fell on the ground, So he had to go with his head between his legs and say, "I'm very sorry, but my son dropped the cornet." So from that day on, he kind of started locking the case. You know, those those wee keys that used to get. He used to start locking the cases. But he started me as a probably about 4 or 4.5, something like that. Like showing me properly how to play. So he was my first teacher, and that kind of really stood me in good stead. He was there was always music in the house, a lot of singing, a lot of playing, and so it was just something that we did, and that's why I started to play the cornet. Started to then play in the junior band, about 7 years old. And at that point, it was a little less complicated than it is nowadays. I think we sometimes want to overthink things. Back then, you basically all you had to do was watch the person next to you, who was obviously a better player because you were starting at the bottom of the section, and she told me she would write in, a couple of the fingerings, and you just kind of learned by doing, But I was certainly playing most days, if not every day. And my parents were really good about that. They never restricted, whether it was 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning or whatever time, I was allowed to play. So it was a great environment to learn. And that's why it's always been brass, and that's why it was always the cornet.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of, was there an event that took place, I guess is the best way to describe it, where you really felt that you improved and moved forward as a player, as a performer?
Yes, there is. You always look ahead. You always look to see who's playing the solos, and you always look to see who's playing the first part. And those are the kind of intermediate steps. Those are the intermediate goals. But I remember when we moved to Alsace, there was one occasion where the National Youth Brass Band of Switzerland gave a concert here in Basel, in the Stadtcasino, the concert hall, beautiful concert hall here in Basel, and it was either 95 or 94, something like that, 94 or 95, and it was the year that Robert Redhead was the guest conductor for the A band, and so there were quite a few of the Salvationists. Probably we would have gone anyway, but we definitely went there because he was taking the A band that time. And the soloists in the evening, they used to have the alternate concerts with soloists. And so the concert here in Basel, the soloists were a very, very fine Swiss tuba player by the name of Guy Michel, who I now conduct every Tuesday night in his local band. And the other one was the cornet soloist Roger Webster, who at that time played 2 solos. The first one was Jubilance, and then he then played I'd Rather Have Jesus. And that was about the first time where I really took an interest in, I think it was probably, it would have been his sound that influenced me straight from the beginning. I thought, wow, that sounds different from most other cornet players. And so I met him after the concert, and we kind of exchanged. At that point, of course, it wasn't emails and whatnot. It was his address. And I remember writing to him to thank him, or to kind of tell him how much I had enjoyed it. And then about a week later, I received this letter. I don't know if he remembers. I haven't actually spoken to him about it for a long time, but I received this handwritten letter with a copy of his CD. Now, at that time, the CD, I think, had just come out. It was Twilight Dreams.
Yeah.
One of his, in fact, if it's not his first one, then it was one of his first CDs. But Twilight Dreams that he'd recorded with CWS Glasgow, and on it were those 2 solos. But that recording, that sound, the fact that he took the time to write a letter to a young, whatever, 15, 16-year-old, really made a huge impression on me. And that was a huge catalyst. That was a huge catalyst for my playing, but my practice. What you practicing? What you want to sound like? You know, we talk on a daily basis with our students about having a sound concept. Up until then, I had been extremely lucky that I had grown up in a family of singers, and we sang all the time. We would sing in the car, we would sing in the house. We were obviously singing at church and various things like that. But his sound was then also this kind of a real boost to my playing. So that was the first one, and then a couple of years later, then I was fortunate enough to be a member of the National Youth Brass Band of Switzerland, and I went along, and the guest conductor was Edward Gregson, and one of the concerts, then his friend James Gourley appeared, and I didn't know who James Gourley was from Adam, but he was along because there was a guy in the band as well that played with Baby O. And he was along to invite me along to the band. So, although that obviously James not being a cornet player, but those two things in rather quick succession, hearing Roger, having that contact with him, and then being under the influence. I wasn't at Baby O for a long time. The distance was quite far, and I didn't drive. A bit of a hassle, but I did it for as long as I could. And so those two things, as a teenager, 16, 17-year-old, something like that, it really made a huge difference.
And we should explain that BBO means Brass Band Berner Oberland, which is a band in Switzerland. Yeah. Just for those that maybe don't follow the Swiss band scene, which is a very fine band. In fact, I think they won the Swiss Open recently. They did. Yeah, they've had a couple of contest successes here recently. So yeah. You mentioned Roger Webster, who is a fabulous cornet player and was involved in the development of a lot of products with Denis Wick. So I was going to ask you, in terms of your choice of mouthpiece and mutes and how that works with the instrument that you play on, maybe explain a little bit about that, because I understand you play on a prototype mouthpiece that you've had for many years, and I'm sure you've tried many different mouthpieces, whether it be for trumpet or cornet.
Yes, when I was 7, my first one of my birthday presents from my parents was a Denis Wick 4B, and I played on this 4B for a long time, at least 7 or 8 years, actually, maybe even 9 years. And on one occasion, I was in Glasgow. I had been invited to come to Glasgow and to play with the Govan Citadel Band of the Salvation Army, who at the time was under the direction of Alan Ramsey, another very fine Salvation Army cornet player who was also the Scottish solo champion on numerous occasions and principal cornet with CWS Glasgow under Howard Snell. And he asked me what I played, as is normally the first question between any two cornet / trumpet players. And he said, it sounded fantastic, but he gave me actually a 4 that he had. So I played on that for a little while. And then I actually got a hold of this prototype, which is more of a 3, Denis Wick 3. And I played on that for a long number of years, until during one of my many moves, couldn't find it. Didn't know where it had gone. And because it was a prototype, it wasn't one that you could just go in and buy. And so I then went down this rabbit hole of, trying other cornet mouthpieces, having them made. That was a hobby for a while, but it just never sounded like I wanted it to sound until about 3 years later, 4 years later, I then found it in a random box. So I'm still playing that same prototype mouthpiece now today, and that's now been a good 15, I would say a good 15 so years. So that's the one I play today, and just out of interest, sometimes to compare, whatever. I just try them, and try a couple, but no, it's kind of like home. It's whenever you put that mouthpiece in, or whenever I put the mouthpiece in, it sounds the way that you want to sound. It gives you the proper, the good vibes back to your playing, and it makes everything a lot easier for me.
Excellent. Yeah. And so quite a tricky question, this one, but one that I ask everybody. Who inspired you more? Was it peers, the people you were growing up with and playing, your colleagues that you play with in rehearsals? Or was it recordings, or would it be your teachers?
Recordings and teachers. Teachers, because if you're lucky enough, then your teachers may at some point then become your peers, depending on how your career goes, So recordings, I already mentioned Twilight Dreams, which was a recording that I listened to ad nauseum. And then I remember, although he's certainly not a cornet player, a recording that I listened to late 90s, early 2000s. It was the first time that I had gone to Star Lake Music Camp of the Salvation Army and spent a lot of time with my good friend Michael Baker. And he had this CD on his car. You know how it's like really humid and warm in the summer at Star Lake, and you just sweat by standing around. During breaks, he and I used to go to his car, and he used to put on the air conditioning, so that was good. So we were listening to this CD, and it was Joe Lacey, and I had never heard anything of the kind. I mean, his sound from low range, extreme low range, all the way up, his lyricism, blah blah blah. So those two CDs for me. One being a cornet player and one just being a phenomenal brass player. And then teachers. Roger was my teacher for a while, whilst I was in Glasgow. And then I came back, and I then studied with the French, well-known French trumpet professor Pierre Thibault, who had been at the Paris Conservatory. He was also the trumpet soloist with the Paris Opera. And he really inspired me. My goodness, the amount of solo trumpet players around Europe and trumpet soloists around Europe and the world that were once his students, the list is extremely long. But when I got to know Pierre Thibault, he was about 72. And I used to go up every second week to Paris, to his house or his apartment, and he used to give me a 3-hour lesson. And I took the train up and down, and I couldn't wait to get home to put everything he told me into practice. And he was extremely inspirational, because 2 or 3 days after our lessons, he would call me up and he would ask me how things were going. And he would ask me was this better, or how did I? And it was like a second, it was like an intermediate lesson over the phone. And so he was extremely inspirational. And I mean, yes, of course, people that you then play with, that you have the opportunity to play with. I played a few times as a trumpet player here in Switzerland with Baroque trumpet player Nicolas Eklund, and he was an absolute freak. So yeah, recordings and teachers. But then also teachers that then you have the opportunity to then play alongside, which is a fantastic privilege and experience when that happens.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Jamie, for your time today. It's been great hearing a couple of the stories and finding out a little bit more about yourself. So I'm sure we'll have another occasion where we'll perhaps talk about teaching techniques on our next. But for now, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much. Thank you.